Hey everybody, my name's Tom Bannard. I work here at VCU. I work with students in recovery. I'm the program coordinator for the Rams in Recovery program. And really excited to talk to you a little bit about working with emerging adults, young adults, who is primarily the folks that I work with, though we're fortunate to have some older students as well that are involved and engaged in the Rams in Recovery supports. And I could just say that this is such an awesome group of folks to work with. Well, a lot of times in crisis, they're pretty difficult group. As they get into recovery, it's just an awesome thing to work with them, and I really enjoy it. So this is just a shot of our graduation last spring. So we graduated 8 students, and I just always like to remind us, hey, this is what is possible with recovery. This is why we do what we do, is to know that our clients can be tremendously successful, and that's the goal. That's what we're working towards. So a little bit about my professional journey is I've worked both in harm reduction models, and so at Caritas, and much of what we do at the Well, where I work now, is harm reduction focused, but also have worked in long-term recovery models, and the Healing Place here in Richmond is an example of a long-term peer-based recovery model. And Rams in Recovery is an example of a long-term peer-based recovery models. And a lot of the times these folks that support one or the other kind of are at odds, kind of over, I guess a pie, how do you divide the pie? Is prevention and harm reduction more important than treatment and recovery? And they're both incredibly important, and we really need to fight for a bigger pie. But ultimately, the goals are the same. We want you to not die and to have a happy and successful life in the harm reduction, and we want you to not die and have a happy and successful life when it comes to long-term recovery. The way we get there might be a little bit different. So I am particularly partial to collegiate recovery, and I have the honor of being on the board of the Association for Recovery in Higher Education. And so I'm particularly passionate about how do we support young people on a collegiate journey. And I do believe that what we've learned about collegiate recovery has so many different implications for how we want to build a recovery-oriented system of care for other young adults, even if their journey is not to go to a collegiate environment. Here you see a map of the expansion of collegiate recovery over the last 3 or 4 years. There are now 145, actually more than that, of kind of what we would call either efforts or programs. The collegiate recovery programs are those that are more established. They have staff, they might have space, whereas the efforts are, hey, there's somebody working on recovery at that campus, but they really haven't devoted the resources to it. So as a professional making referrals, if you have a young adult with a serious substance use disorder and you are not really, as they look at schools, at colleges, if you're really not pointing them towards schools and colleges that have collegiate recovery programs, it's something that you really got to think about, because there's a big difference between being on a campus that's generally recovery hostile, and for there to be a group of people and a way to access the people who know what recovery is, and then being somewhere where, hey, there aren't the young people in recovery that are easily identifiable, and there aren't the structures and systems in place to support those students. Because what you find with collegiate recovery is that the students, when you support those students in their recovery, they do really well. It's certainly been the case at VCU, and you've seen some national studies of schools like Texas Tech and Augsburg and Kennesaw State that just have these tremendous recovery outcomes, and almost on par of what you see with doctors and airline pilots, who are the best have the best treatment outcomes of any subpopulation. So as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about collegiate recovery, but I also think about the larger system of care. And so I think that a university campus is a big place. We're a big place, but certainly not as big as the larger system of care. But I always think, like, we have got to get this right on a university campus, and maybe that can be a model for other, states and other counties and cities, and how do we do substance use. So I think about a few different things. I think about no judgment, right? We've got to reduce some of the stigma around substance use disorders. When I think about, okay, what does our college campus need to be? I think about help everywhere. And so, people generally don't just show up to a substance use counselor and say, I need help. Usually, if that's the case, usually they're pretty bad. We've got to identify people earlier in that process of kind of declining into substance use disorder. And so we've got to have more places that can get people to the right place. So when I think about, what do we need to do differently? Whenever someone presents in need of help, we need to get them to the place that they need to be. I think that our prevention needs to be recovery informed, and this is where we as folks that are primarily working with people that already have a substance use disorder need to be a better resource to those who do prevention, because we may do great prevention, but we don't have any prevention that has been 100% effective. We are always, even though there's some really good prevention interventions, we are always going to have people that misuse substances and do so, in a way that is really damaging to their health. So we need to work with prevention people to say, hey, if you find that you're having these issues with substances, let's get you the support and help that you need. And I think there's an onus on us to do a better job as professionals to engage and really understand prevention and figure out where we fit into that. Harm reduction, absolutely, we need to always think about harm reduction, in that, how do we, if somebody is not at a place where they're ready to change, how do we help them to reduce the harm around their use? And that's always needs to be a goal when we're providing substance use counseling, is we have to keep harm reduction in mind as a priority. Treatment, treatment, more and more there's moves towards providing more and better treatment kind of in place that, can we provide treatment very close to our college campus that's convenient for our students, because a lot of our students are not ready to take a bunch of time off and go to inpatient treatment. So can we provide a lower level of intervention that's still helpful and effective? And then recovery support, which is what we do with Ramsden Recovery. I think about this though, this is not specific to a campus. This is what we need to do to make it easier to access treatment systemically. A college environment is a great place to kind of move towards a better system of care, and then we can build out from there. So again, I said no wrong door, wherever someone turns. So on a college campus, this might look like training your staff and students to get people to the right place. We always have a responsibility towards outreach, and this is especially true of young adults. So we have to figure out how do we be in their spaces and give them a message that they can hear. Often that's through their parents, and the next session will be about parent engagement. But we want to figure out, how do we get this message to a young adult in a way that they can hear it, in a place that they can hear it. And so I think about, no wrong door in terms of getting them engaged in services. I want to talk a little bit about the developmental needs of emerging adults, and then talk how do we address that in our context on a college campus. So we think about the developmental needs of young adults. And right, as you're a substance use counselor, you really have to think about, okay, how do we get this person engaged in these ways to meet their needs? And that's also why you're seeing this huge trend in substance use treatment towards treating young adults as a separate category in a separate way than older adults. Often you're seeing people that are financially dependent, and so they haven't been through this developmental stage, and so their needs are pretty different from an older adult. And so especially for primary treatment, you're seeing more and more folks that are separated out, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. So when you're thinking about developmental needs, right, obviously there's a personal safety need there for a young adult. There's a need for emotional security, that, you know, hey, they have friends they can trust, they have people around them that they can rely on, that there's some degree of stability, that there's a sense of identity. And we got to remember that people that have struggled with substance use disorders might experience the initiation of recovery or treatment as a loss of an identity, right? That if people experience their addiction as an identity gain, like many people do, especially if you don't belong to another social circle, right, then you will experience addiction as an identity gain. This, you know, your substance use is this new identity that you have. And so when you lose that identity, that's a very painful process for people, where there isn't an immediate recovery identity. That recovery identity takes time to develop. And so many people will experience addiction as an identity gain and recovery as early recovery as an identity loss. This is, I think, especially so of folks that are already getting into treatment situations at a young age. On the other hand, right, you may find folks that had many different groups that they identified in. They might have a soccer team. They might have identified as a athlete and a scholar, or as their profession and that sort of thing. And they may have actually experienced their identity as an identity loss, losing identities as they dipped further into their addiction. And so for those folks, the developmental needs are different, because then they experience recovery as this kind of ability to regain these other identities. But it's really worth paying attention to as you're working with people was that person's experience with substance use an identity gain or an identity loss? Because that will give you some insight in terms of what does that person need to do to move towards thriving. So we'll talk a little bit more about identity as we move forward. And I think that's something that we do really well in collegiate recovery. Sense of competence, right? This is can I do stuff, right? Am I capable? And I think that's a really important question for young adults. Am I capable of doing things? And it's, for me, helping students have success in school really meets this need developmentally. And then belonging and mission, right? Do I have my people? Are my people here? And then do I have a purpose? Like, I have to start developing my purpose in life as a young adult. And so that's part of our job, is to help students kind of understand, okay, what is it? Okay, now I'm in recovery, what do I do with this? Or I'm exploring this life without substances. What's next? What do I do? When we think about our services, our supports that we offer students, we really think about peer-based services, informal services, and how do we meet students, at the moments where they really need support. And this is something that, as a system, I think we're really bad at. As a treatment system, we're really, really bad at. We're good when they're here inpatient, but when they're released, they're going into their therapy is usually during the day, during the week. There might be limited after-hours supports. We've got to find a way to hook them in to supports that are convenient to them, not convenient to us. And so this is where we really like to utilize students that are further along in their recovery to support those behind them, right? This is something that peer support does a whole lot better than we do as professionals, because they're okay being available at 11 o'clock at night. That's what they'll do for their friends. Whereas, I'm in bed. I don't know about you. I'm in bed at about 9:30. So I'm not all that helpful to my students late at night. But their peers are. And if we can support and leverage those peers in a meaningful way, they can get a lot of informal support at times when they really need it. So, part of that is setting up things that really build community. So, having fun activities. So in an inpatient or even in an outpatient, this might look like experiential therapy. This might look like bowling trips, right? Like the different facilities do this in different ways. There's a facility in Florida that they do glow-in-the-dark ultimate frisbee. That these are ways that build community, and they don't have to be expensive. We certainly believe that this is a key part of recovery for our students. And then we really, really want to affirm people's recovery identities. So we talked a little bit before about an addiction identity, but when people get into recovery, that becomes an identity that's really, really important to them. And how do we support and affirm that identity within, a college atmosphere that is hostile, right? A general environment that's hostile to recovery. We have to help people kind of find their tribe, find the group of people that they really jive with. Part of that, I think that peer support is a key pathway to this. So for us, we really believe in many pathways to recovery, but we really think that that peer-based supports are a huge ingredient to successful recovery. Not the only way to successful recovery, but the more we can get students involved in peer supports, the better they do. The more meaning and purpose they find in their lives, the more stable they stay. And so that might be 12-step, which is the most widely available peer support. But it may be faith-based, and it may be refuge recovery, and it may be smart recovery. And certainly you'll find folks that kind of recover without a whole lot of support, right? That's actually a very common thing in the literature. But we really think that peer support and engaging in peer support is really predictive of long-term recovery success. So at VCU, this is last year we had more than 500 mutual aid groups. We had a whole lot of attendance, and we're able to leverage community members to really support our students. I'm going to talk about that in a second, about a little bit of Dr. Kelly's and some others' research around specifically young people and 12-step. And so what we see, this is on the left, we've got adults 30 and older in this particular study. This is probably an area that doesn't have a whole lot of young people's recovery. You've got adults 30 plus, and you've got younger adults here. And these are kind of graphs of the mechanisms through which 12-step works. So this study kind of says, yes, this really does work for young adults. They really do well when they engage in 12-step recovery, but they benefit to the same extent in different ways, okay? And so about a quarter of the mechanism through which 12-step recovery works for older adults is giving them taking them away from the social network that was pro-drinking, and delivering a social network that was pro-abstinence, right? So they're hanging out with a lot of heavy drinkers, and they're no longer doing that, and so they're more successful in their recovery. And that accounts for about 25% of this mechanism. Over here, it accounts for more than half. Removing the pro-drinking social element is a huge mechanism for which young people in recovery that AA works for, right? Is getting them away from those people that are kind of a bad influence, right? That is a huge deal, and that these other things are much less. There's some effect of having a pro-abstinence social network, but it's more about not having a pro-drinking social network. Over here, there's a much stronger impact from having a pro-abstinence social network, and in both cases, their own self-efficacy is really important. Again, John Kelly, who runs the Recovery Research Institute, is a personal hero of mine, and really encourage you to check out recoveryanswers.org, which is his website. It's just a fabulous resource. So what you see in the darker color is a days abstinent at 3 months, and in the lighter color, it's the days abstinence in the next 3 months, right? So this is 0 to 90 days, this is 91 to 180 days, right, in this orange color. So what you see is that in this situation, right, so the first 90 days, right, if they're in groups with all teens, they do really, really well, right? But then that second 90 days, they do well, but they don't do as well as over here, where you have an even mix of young and old, right? And so over here, if you're in meetings with all adults, right, you do okay, but not as well as any of these other conditions. And then you do really poorly, at least comparatively. I mean, you're still talking about 55, an average of 55 out of 90 days abstinent, if you're just in these meetings with all adults, right? And so that kind of what it kind of suggests is that there's this kind of sweet spot in here where there's a mix, or at least some older influences involved to support their recovery. And so, how this research plays out for us at VCU as we're kind of putting together supportive services for our students is we're trying to get them roped in with their peers as quickly as possible, so they really get to know some other people, other young people in recovery. So they're not saying, well, it's only this AA or this NA or this refuge recovery or this smart recovery. This only applies to these old farts. It doesn't apply to me. And then they walk in and it's a room of their peers and they're like, oh no, these are my people, and they do, drink or use or whatever like me, and so I can do this. But then what we really try to get is in community engagement, those really healthy people that are in longer term recovery to engage with our students, to come to meetings on campus, because we think it's really important to have that older influence, that mix. And we also try to get our students off campus going to recovery meetings where they're going to see more of a mix in their social network, because if you're just listening to other young people about things that they haven't experienced or haven't had success with, that's not a great recipe for success either. So as somebody moves forward in their recovery, we're really trying to get them hooked into healthy older social networks where they can find some really good mentorship. So that's really the extent of what I want to talk to you about in terms of working with young adults and engaging with young adults. They are just an awesome group of people to work with. It is really cool to kind of see the lights come on, to see them help other people, and we're starting to see more and more recovery supports that are more adapted and more specific to young people, where you're having, you've got the Association for Recovery Schools, so you've got some recovery high schools, and we're really trying to do a much better job of supporting young people and creating communities that support young people in recovery. So I thank you again for your time. Feel free to reach out to me if I can support you in your journey in any way. I'd love to do that. Thanks so much.